There's a man who sits on a golden throne in the desert, who smiles at American presidents, shakes their hands, signs their deals, poses for their cameras, and then, the moment they turn around, quietly does exactly the opposite of what they hoped for. He doesn't shout, he doesn't threaten, he doesn't make speeches about breaking with the West. He simply builds, quietly, patiently, brick by brick, a new world where Saudi Arabia answers to no one, especially not Washington. And the most terrifying part, America has barely noticed. His name is Mohammed bin Salman. The world calls him MBS. And what he is doing right now, beneath the surface of handshakes and investment deals and official state visits, is one of the most audacious geopolitical pivots of the 21st century. He is not just renegotiating the US-Saudi relationship. He is dismantling the very foundations it was built on. And he is doing it so slowly, so deliberately, and so skillfully that by the time Washington fully understands what has happened, it will already be too late to reverse. To understand why this matters so deeply, you have to understand what this relationship actually was, and why it was considered unbreakable for nearly 80 years. It started in 1945. Franklin D. Roosevelt, one of the most powerful presidents America had ever seen, sailed into the Suez Canal on a warship and met with King Abdulaziz ibn Saud on the deck of the USS Quincy. Two men from completely different worlds looked at each other across that deck and made a deal that would shape the next century of global history. America would guarantee Saudi Arabia's security, its survival, its borders, its throne. Saudi Arabia, in return, would pump oil in the volumes that America needed, price that oil in American dollars, and keep the global energy market stable in America's favor. It was simple. It was clean. And for 8 decades it held, through the Cold War, through oil embargoes, through the Gulf War, when American soldiers poured into Saudi soil to push Saddam Hussein back, through September 11th, when 15 of the 19 hijackers turned out to be Saudi nationals, and the relationship survived even that. Through every crisis, every tension, every moment of strain, the deal held, because both sides needed it. America needed the oil, needed the dollars recycled back through Wall Street, needed a stable anchor in the most volatile region on Earth. Saudi Arabia needed the security umbrella, the weapons, the protection from Iran, from Iraq, from anyone who might look at that oil wealth and feel tempted. But MBS watched all of that history and saw something different. He didn't see an unbreakable alliance. He saw a cage, a gilded, comfortable, enormously profitable cage, but a cage nonetheless. A relationship where Saudi Arabia could only ever be the junior partner, where the Americans could lecture Riyadh about human rights while selling it weapons, where Washington could pressure Saudi oil policy based on its own domestic politics, where every major Saudi decision had to be filtered through the question of what Washington would think. MBS looked at that cage and decided, with the cold calculation that defines everything he does, that he was going to walk out of it, not by slamming the door, by quietly, methodically removing the bars, one at a time. The first bar he removed was the assumption that Saudi Arabia needed American protection more than America needed Saudi cooperation. That assumption had been the bedrock of Washington's leverage over Riyadh for decades. If you believe you are indispensable to someone's survival, you believe you have the upper hand, and America believed exactly that. But MBS understood something that Washington was too comfortable to see clearly. The world had changed. America was no longer the only great power that could offer security guarantees. It was no longer the only market for Saudi oil. It was no longer the only source of advanced technology, investment, or diplomatic cover. China had risen. Russia had hardened. The multipolar world that American foreign policy analysts had debated in think tanks for years had actually arrived. And MBS had been watching it arrive with intense, focused attention. So he started building alternatives, not as a replacement for America, not as a declaration of war against Washington, but as options, as leverage, as the kind of strategic independence that would allow him to say, the next time an American president pressured him, that he had somewhere else to go. The construction of those alternatives is the real story of what MBS has been doing for the last several years. And it is a story of extraordinary patience and strategic intelligence. The moment that truly changed everything in MBS's mind happened on the 14th of September 2019. That morning, 17 drones and cruise missiles screamed through the pre-dawn darkness and slammed into the heart of Saudi Arabia's oil infrastructure, the Abqaiq processing facility and the Khurais oil field. In a matter of hours, roughly 5% of the world's entire daily oil supply had been knocked offline. The fires burned for days. The shock rippled through every energy market on the planet, and MBS waited for America to respond. Donald Trump was president. Trump had spent years presenting himself as Saudi Arabia's most loyal friend in Washington. He had defended the kingdom after the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in ways that shocked even some of his own allies. He had called MBS directly, repeatedly, warmly. He had sold Saudi Arabia more weapons than any administration in history. And now, with Saudi oil infrastructure burning, and Iran, the most plausible architect of the attack, Sitting right there across the Gulf, MBS waited for America to act. No strike on Iran. No military response. Just more troops sent to Saudi soil in a defensive posture that made America look cautious and Saudi Arabia look vulnerable. MBS received the message with perfect clarity. When the moment of genuine crisis arrived, America would protect itself first and Saudi Arabia second. That was not the deal that had been promised in 1945. And from that moment forward, MBS began building his exit strategy in earnest. The first major signal that something had fundamentally shifted came in October 2022, and it arrived in the form of a number, 2 million. That was the number of barrels per day that OPEC Plus, the oil cartel that MBS had co-founded with Vladimir Putin in 2016, announced it would cut from global production. 2 million barrels, reduced at the exact moment that the Biden administration was desperately begging Riyadh to pump more to bring down fuel prices that were politically destroying the American president. Biden had made the humiliating journey to Saudi Arabia himself just months earlier, fist-bumping MBS on camera in a scene that his own advisors had warned would look weak. He had asked personally for more oil. He had laid out America's need with the kind of directness that leaders rarely use with each other. And MBS had looked at him, nodded, and then coordinated a production cut with Russia, the country that America was simultaneously trying to economically isolate and punish for its invasion of Ukraine. American officials were furious in a way they rarely allow themselves to be publicly. They described the Saudi decision as a hostile act. They said Riyadh was actively helping Moscow circumvent Western sanctions by keeping oil prices high enough for Russia to fund its war. They talked about consequences, about reviewing the relationship, about reassessing everything, and MBS essentially shrugged. Because he had done the calculation. He had looked at what America could actually do to Saudi Arabia if it wanted to punish it, weighed that against what he stood to gain by asserting independence, and decided the risk was worth taking. He was right. Nothing happened. No consequences materialized. And the relationship staggered forward, wounded but intact, which was exactly the outcome MBS had predicted. What made that OPEC cut so significant was not just its immediate economic effect. It was the proof of concept it represented. It demonstrated that MBS could defy Washington directly, suffer no serious consequences, and emerge from the confrontation with his position actually strengthened. Saudi Arabia had acted as an independent power pursuing its own interests, rather than as a junior partner managing its patrons' preferences. That was new, that was different, and it told the world, told China, told Russia, told every other country watching, that the old order was not as solid as it had appeared. The second pillar of MBS's alternative architecture was his relationship with China, a relationship he has cultivated with a patience and strategic vision that Washington consistently underestimated. In December 2022, Xi Jinping made the most significant Chinese state visit to the Arab world in modern history. He arrived in Riyadh to a welcome that was extraordinary even by Saudi standards. Saudi fighter jets painted the sky red in honor of the Chinese flag. Xi and MBS signed a comprehensive strategic partnership agreement that elevated the relationship between the two countries to an entirely new level. Investment deals, technology cooperation, energy agreements, diplomatic frameworks, the architecture of a deep bilateral relationship assembled in a matter of days. But the most devastating blow to American prestige in the region came not from a trade deal or a diplomatic summit. It came from a single act of mediation that announced to the entire world that the era of American dominance in the Middle East was genuinely over. In March 2023, Saudi Arabia and Iran, bitter rivals whose hostility had defined the region's fault lines for decades, restored their diplomatic ties. They shook hands, opened embassies, pledged cooperation. The mediator who made it happen, who sat both sides down and worked through the details, was not the American Secretary of State. It was not a Biden envoy. It was not anyone from Washington at all. It was China. Beijing had done the job that America had claimed for itself for generations, the job of managing and stabilizing the Gulf, and it had done it right there in front of everyone to see. The symbolism was almost too perfect to be accidental, and it probably wasn't. MBS had allowed China to broker that deal because it served his purposes precisely. It showed that Saudi Arabia had options Washington couldn't block. It showed that Iran could be managed without American involvement. It advanced his Vision 2030 economic agenda by reducing the security threat from Tehran that made investors nervous. And it deepened his leverage with Washington by demonstrating that there were other powers capable of playing a role in the region's future. Every piece of that calculation served MBS's longer strategy. None of it was accidental. None of it was naive. While all of this was unfolding, MBS was also quietly constructing something that alarmed Western security analysts, even more than his relationship with Beijing. In September 2025, Iran launched missile strikes against Qatar. Israel, in the chaos of its ongoing regional military operations, struck Doha in a move that shocked even its American allies. The Gulf was burning with a new urgency. And in the immediate aftermath of that crisis, while Washington was still trying to process what had happened, Saudi Arabia moved. MBS signed a strategic mutual defense agreement with Pakistan, a country that has nuclear weapons, a battle-hardened military, and deep Islamic solidarity with the Gulf states. The ink was barely dry on that agreement when Turkey made clear that it wanted to join. Think about what that means for a moment. Saudi Arabia's enormous financial resources, Pakistan's nuclear deterrent, Turkey's advanced military capability and NATO experience. 3 countries, none of them formally aligned with Washington against the others, coming together in a security framework that bypasses the American system entirely. Western analysts immediately started calling it the Islamic NATO, though that phrase makes it sound more formal and structured than it actually is. It is better understood as a constellation, a loose alignment of powers that each have their own reasons for wanting alternatives to total dependence on Washington, and who have found in MBS a leader with both the vision and the resources to make that constellation real. And then, as if to underline how completely the regional map was being redrawn, came the December 2025 rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Qatar. 8 years earlier, MBS had led the most dramatic diplomatic rupture in Gulf history, coordinating with the UAE, Bahrain, and Egypt to impose a total blockade on Qatar, cutting off land borders, closing airspace, demanding that Doha shut down Al Jazeera, cut ties with Iran, and expel Turkish troops. It was the most aggressive assertion of Saudi regional dominance in a generation. Qatar refused every demand. The standoff lasted more than 3 years and divided the Gulf in ways that America found deeply uncomfortable. And now MBS flew to Doha and signed defense agreements, investment deals, and transportation pacts with the same leader he had tried to strangle economically just years before. The world watched and tried to understand what it meant. What it meant was this. MBS had decided that the threats of 2017, Qatar's relationship with political Islamist movements, its friendship with Turkey, its independent foreign policy, mattered less than the opportunities of 2025. What mattered in 2025 was building a Gulf that could defend itself, that could make collective decisions, that did not need Washington to hold it together or Washington's permission to act. Qatar brought financial muscle, media power through Al Jazeera, and influence over networks across the Islamic world. Turkey brought military reach, manufacturing capability, and ambition. Pakistan brought the ultimate deterrent. Saudi Arabia brought money, oil, and the diplomatic weight of being the custodian of Mecca and Medina. Together, they represented something genuinely new, a power block that operated in the same space as American influence without being defined or constrained by it. None of this has escaped Washington's attention. American policymakers have spent years debating how to respond, how to re-anchor Saudi Arabia in the American orbit, how to use the promise of normalization with Israel as the lever that would pull Riyadh back toward the U.S.-led order. The Abraham Accords, the 2020 normalization agreements between Israel and the UAE, Bahrain, Sudan, and Morocco, were always conceived as the first step toward a much bigger prize. Saudi Arabia's normalization with Israel would transform the entire regional architecture. It would create a formal U.S.-Israel Gulf alliance capable of containing Iran, would embed Saudi Arabia deeply in the American strategic framework, and would represent the most significant diplomatic achievement in the Middle East since the Camp David Accords. Both Trump and Biden desperately wanted it. Both made it a central pillar of their Middle East strategy. And MBS has refused to deliver it. His stated conditions for normalization are demanding to the point of being deliberately unreachable. He wants a binding mutual defense treaty, the kind that requires Senate ratification and that America has never offered any country in the region. He wants a credible pathway to Palestinian statehood, something that Israeli domestic politics makes effectively impossible. He wants civilian nuclear cooperation, the right for Saudi Arabia to enrich uranium on its own soil, which raises proliferation concerns so serious that American officials have described it as a potential red line. Each of these conditions, taken individually, is a serious demand. Taken together, they form something that looks less like a negotiating position and more like a permanent veto. MBS knows that Washington cannot deliver all 3. He almost certainly knows that Washington cannot deliver even 2 of them in their current forms, which means that normalization with Israel, the crown jewel of American regional diplomacy, remains in his hands, available to be offered or withheld as his strategic interests dictate. By keeping normalization off the table, MBS ensures that America stays in a permanent state of strategic want in the region. Washington needs the deal more than Riyadh does. Israel wants it desperately. The diplomatic legacy value is enormous. And MBS holds all the cards. That asymmetry, the fact that America is the supplicant while Saudi Arabia is the prize, represents perhaps the most profound inversion in the entire history of the relationship. For 80 years, Saudi Arabia needed America. Now, increasingly, it is America that needs Saudi Arabia. And MBS understands this with a precision that should unsettle everyone in Washington who still thinks of Riyadh as a dependent partner rather than an increasingly autonomous power. The November 2025 summit between MBS and Trump illustrates this inversion with almost painful clarity. MBS arrived in Washington having spent years under a cloud. The 2018 murder of Washington Post journalist Jamal Khashoggi had made him a pariah to much of the American political establishment, a figure that many senators refused to meet, and that the Biden administration had publicly condemned. Trump's return to power offered the rehabilitation MBS wanted, and he got it. Trump defended him from press questions about Khashoggi with a directness that left American journalists visibly stunned. Saudi Arabia was granted Major Non-NATO Ally status. The promise of F-35 fighter jets was placed on the table. The diplomatic rehabilitation was complete. In return, America received a $1 trillion investment pledge that analysts described as largely symbolic and almost certainly undeliverable in the time frame promised. It received closer cooperation on artificial intelligence through a new joint venture called Humane. It received warmer rhetoric and better optics at a moment when Trump wanted to show foreign policy wins. But it received no binding defense commitment that America had to fulfill. It received no Israel normalization. It received none of the things that would have genuinely locked Saudi Arabia back into the American orbit. The Washington Post concluded that MBS gained more from the trip than the United States did. Saudi commentators framed it differently. They described MBS as having demonstrated Saudi Arabia's substantive independence even while cooperating closely. Both assessments were probably right. What makes MBS's strategy so difficult for Washington to counter is that it does not look from the outside like hostility. He is not building an anti-American alliance. He is not making speeches about replacing the dollar or tearing up the existing order. He shakes hands warmly. He welcomes American investment. He shows up at summits. He signs deals. He says the right things in front of cameras. And then he signs different deals in different rooms with different partners and builds the architecture of independence one quiet agreement at a time. It is strategic ambiguity raised to the level of high art. It is the behavior not of an enemy, but of a sovereign power that has simply decided it will no longer be anyone's client, not even the client of the country that has protected it for 80 years. The deepest problem for Washington is that MBS is not wrong about the underlying change in the world that makes his strategy possible. The unipolar moment, the era of American dominance that followed the Cold War and that formed the backdrop for the deepest period of U.S.-Saudi interdependence, is genuinely over. China is a peer competitor in ways that the Soviet Union never quite managed to be in the economic domain. Russia, despite the catastrophe of its Ukraine war, remains a major energy power and a disruptor capable of creating leverage in unexpected places. The global South has stopped automatically deferring to Washington on matters of foreign policy alignment. The dollar's dominance, while still profound, is being slowly chipped away at around the edges. And oil, the original glue of the U.S.-Saudi relationship, is no longer as politically and economically central to American interests as it once was, particularly as the U.S. has become an energy exporter in its own right. MBS read all of those trends correctly and early. He understood that a world of genuine multipolarity was coming, that the window for building strategic optionality was open, and that the country that positioned itself to play multiple great powers against each other, rather than being wholly aligned with one of them, would have an enormous advantage in the decades ahead. Saudi Arabia's extraordinary resources, oil wealth, sovereign investment funds, the religious legitimacy of the holy cities, the geographic centrality between Asia, Africa, and Europe, made it uniquely positioned to pursue exactly that strategy. And MBS, for all the horror of Khashoggi's murder and the ruthlessness of his consolidation of power at home, has pursued that external strategy with a focus and sophistication that demands to be taken seriously. The Russia dimension adds another layer of complexity that Washington finds almost impossible to address cleanly. MBS's relationship with Vladimir Putin has been one of the defining partnerships of the OPEC Plus era. The two men speak regularly. They coordinate on oil production in ways that have served both their fiscal interests. Russia values their relationship because Saudi Arabia's cooperation within OPEC Plus gives Moscow a degree of economic insulation against Western sanctions. Saudi Arabia values the relationship because it gives Riyadh direct influence over one of the world's other major energy producers, and a partnership with a country that Washington cannot pressure or punish into compliance. The fact that Russia is simultaneously conducting a brutal war in Ukraine and deepening its energy partnership with America's most important Arab ally would have been unthinkable 20 years ago. Today, it is simply the reality of the multipolar world that MBS helped construct. American officials have tried various approaches to pull Saudi Arabia back into closer alignment. They have tried pressure, threatening to review weapons sales after the 2022 OPEC cut, warning about consequences for enabling Russia. The pressure produced no meaningful change in Saudi behavior. They have tried incentives, offering the normalization framework, the defense treaty discussions, the weapons packages. The incentives have been taken where useful and ignored where they weren't. The personal diplomacy improved atmospherics without changing the underlying trajectory. Nothing has reversed the fundamental drift, because the fundamental drift is not a tactical choice that can be negotiated away. It is a strategic decision by a leader who has thought deeply about where the world is going and decided where Saudi Arabia needs to be in it. The irony at the heart of this story is that America's own policies helped create the conditions for its displacement. The 2003 Iraq War, which America launched over Saudi objections, destroyed the regional balance of power in ways that empowered Iran and created the security vacuum that MBS now has to navigate. The Obama administration's nuclear deal with Iran, which Riyadh viewed as a betrayal that legitimized its greatest enemy, deepened Saudi distrust of American reliability as a partner. The chaotic American withdrawal from Afghanistan in 2021 reinforced the message that Washington's commitments could evaporate when they became domestically inconvenient. And the failure to respond to the Abqaiq attack confirmed once and for all that the original 1945 bargain, American security guarantees in exchange for Saudi oil cooperation, had become one-sided in ways that no longer served Riyadh's interests. What does the end state of this process look like if MBS succeeds? It does not look like Saudi Arabia breaking with America. It does not look like the kingdom choosing China or Russia over the West. It looks like something more subtle and more consequential. A Saudi Arabia that is genuinely non-aligned in the Cold War sense of that term, that maintains warm relations with Washington while coordinating with Beijing, that sells oil to both American allies and American rivals, that sits in OPEC meetings with Russia and in investment forums with Wall Street, that hosts American military bases while building its own regional security architecture, that smiles at every flag and bows to none. A Saudi Arabia that is, in the most precise meaning of the term, a sovereign power, answerable to its own interests and its own calculus, not to any external patron's preferences or pressures. That is what MBS is building, and the evidence suggests he is closer to achieving it than most people in Washington are willing to admit. The Saudi-Pakistan Defense Pact exists. The China Comprehensive Strategic Partnership exists. The Iran détente brokered by Beijing exists. The Qatar rapprochement exists. The OPEC Plus coordination with Russia exists. The Israel normalization freeze exists. The refusal to accept a subservient role in the American-led order exists. None of these things are going to unhappen. They are facts on the ground. The facts of a new regional order that MBS has been constructing, one quiet agreement at a time. While America looked at the handshakes and the investment pledges and told itself the relationship was fundamentally intact. The alliance is not dead. MBS is too smart to kill it. A dead alliance produces a crisis, a confrontation, a forced choice, and forced choices are exactly what he wants to avoid. What he wants instead is something more sophisticated and more permanent. He wants a relationship where America still matters, where American weapons still flow, where American companies still invest, where the diplomatic connection still functions, but where none of that translates into American leverage over Saudi decisions. He wants the benefits of the relationship without the obligations. He wants the security hardware without the security dependence. He wants Washington's friendship and Beijing's partnership and Moscow's cooperation and Islamabad's deterrent and Ankara's military reach and Doha's financial networks, all at the same time, all serving Saudi interests, none of them owning Saudi Arabia's choices. And here is the most confronting truth of all. He might actually pull it off. Because the world he is building toward, a multipolar world where mid-sized powers can play great powers against each other rather than being owned by any one of them, is not a fantasy. It is already partially real. And MBS, sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, controlling the holy cities of Islam, commanding a sovereign wealth fund of extraordinary scale, and demonstrating a strategic patience and vision that is rare in any leader anywhere, MBS is better positioned than almost any other leader on earth to thrive in exactly that world. Washington is going to have to decide, sooner rather than later, how it responds to a Saudi Arabia that is no longer its client. The choices are not comfortable. Confrontation risks pushing Riyadh further toward Beijing. Accommodation risks confirming that American leverage has disappeared. The middle path, pretending their relationship is what it used to be while quietly adjusting expectations, is what both sides are currently doing. But it is not a strategy. It is a delay. And MBS, who thinks in decades while Washington thinks in electoral cycles, knows that time is on his side. He sits on that golden throne in the desert and smiles at American presidents. He signs their deals and welcomes their cameras and says all the right things. And then, when they turn around, he keeps building. Quietly, patiently. A new world where Saudi Arabia answers to no one, especially not Washington. And the most terrifying part is that he is almost finished.